far. This is an interest group that has evolved since the June convention, the LWV US convention in Denver. And we are gathering names of people and hoping to, have an interest group where we do education and some advocacy. But today we have a member of our steering committee who is a really illustrious person, as well as a president of the San Juan Islands League, and it's Susan Martin. So I'm going to say a couple of words about her. She's going to speak for maybe up to a half hour or so. We'll have some question and answers. And then we have a couple of business items we'd like to talk about in the remainder of the meeting. It may go over an hour. For those of you who have to leave, we're glad you came. If you can stay, but it's not going to go more than an hour and a quarter. So Susan is the Donald Hertzberg Professor Emerita of International Migration at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She was the founder of Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration. Before joining Georgetown's faculty, she was the executive director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform. There are many more things that could be said about her, but I really just would like to turn it over to her. And we've asked her to speak on asylum and refugee policies. So Susan, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining. I'm going to share my screen, assuming I can.
Okay.
And yes, I can.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
Yes, here we go. I did a slight variation on the title of the presentation, The Tempest Tossed. So I'm sure all of you know. Don't hear. Can you still hear me? I just got a note that Zoom was no longer working.
I can hear you. So
Yeah.
did you get it? There a name on the note, Susan? We can try to find them and figure out why their computers.
No, it
didn't say who it was from. Well, they'll figure it out, or they'll sign off and sign back in again. Most people know how to do this now. Let's go. Let's just continue.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I come back on, but
it looked great when you found.
I know.
There you go. And then start the slideshow. And then you can start the slideshow and
we're still trying. Okay. I mean, so hopefully this won't happen again. One of the few disadvantages of living on an island is that sometimes our internet is not the greatest. But anyway, I was going to say that I'm sure that you're familiar with Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty, in which she says that you should send these the homeless tempest taught to me. I left my lamp besides the golden door. Well, we haven't always had a golden door for immigration or for refugees, but my bottom line and my response to my own question is that yes, we still are a refuge, but there are many, many problems with our immigration and refugee policies, and we seriously face
I have already updated a million things.
We will continue to be the refuge that we'd like to think we are. I'm going to start very briefly giving you some statistics on the global situation, because that's context for understanding why it's so important that the U.S. has well thought through and implemented policies. On the left side of this picture is a picture of the Rohingya from Myanmar heading into Bangladesh. On the right side are the Ukrainian refugees who going into Poland. It gives you two different sides of the refugee situation. But one of the reasons I think this is such an important issue for the League of Women Voters is that the majority of people who are displaced around the world are women and their dependent children. Many live in single households where they are the single breadwinner support for their families. We tend to see a lot of pictures of men as refugees, particularly coming into the US or coming into Europe. But that's really the exception. In the rest of the world, it's up to 75, 80, sometimes even 90% are women and children. And I've seen that in refugee camps and in settlements in urban areas around the world. So it's a common factor. The number of people who are displaced around the world, it's the total numbers, not the movements of people in a single year, are now estimated to have surpassed 100 million people. Out of the total world's population, it's not a huge number, but it is certainly significant. And what is even more significant is that it's more than doubled in the last decade. And so it's a problem that is there now and will likely increase in the future. This is counting only people displaced because of conflict and persecution, serious human rights violations. It doesn't capture the number of people who are displaced by natural hazards, earthquakes, lots of the results of climate change in terms of storms and flooding and things of that sort. So the numbers of displaced people is even much higher than this 100 million is. But it's not evenly distributed. More than half of the people who are displaced are still within their own countries. They're internally displaced. In some cases, the international community is able to reach them and help them, but in many cases, not most cases, they're out of reach of both their own governments as well as international authorities. The UN attempts to help them, but it's often a losing battle because they're very close to the conflict zones from which they're fleeing. There are just over 21 million who are refugees under the mandate of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR for short. And they're people who are outside of their country of origin for the same reasons, basically, that internally displaced persons have had to flee because of persecution, human rights violations, and conflict and the complete collapse of governance in their countries. There are another almost 6 million Palestinian refugees who, because of sort of what happened in 1948, are actually under a different UN agency, the UN Relief and Works Administration. And they are the original people who were displaced in 48, but also all of their family members. But they are they're only counted as Palestinian refugees if they're still in the Middle East, in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied territories. They're getting on to 5 million asylum seekers, people who have not yet been recognized as refugees, but once they are recognized, they will have some standing and be treated in the same way the other refugees are. But if they don't get recognized, then they're under threat of deportation or return unless they qualify from some status. And then there's a different number for Venezuelans, but just over 4 million, and probably still increasing as we speak. And they are seen differently because there's not so much a threat of persecution or conflict, but this collapse of governance and the horrendous economic situation that is faced in places like Venezuela. And they are under getting help from both the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration, because they fit in between regular migration and refugee movements. And so this is sort of how the numbers unfold. Now, the US has historically taken the principal responsibility and policy leadership on refugee issues. And this has been the case for decades. And when the US has played a positive leadership role, millions of lives are saved. The US has an extremely important role to play. And it does, and I'll get into how we play our leadership role, but there are a variety of factors that have influenced over time whether the US takes leadership on any given refugee issue. Very, very important has been the linkages between US foreign policy and refugee protection. So during the Cold War, the US was, out front all of the time. Presidents, regardless of their party, referred to refugees as the people who were voting with their feet because they were choosing to leave communist countries or forced to leave them. And since the end of the Cold War, there's been a bit of a lacunae there in that there isn't a justification that has such strong linkages to foreign policy as it had been previously. And I would argue, and have in my own writings, that this is something that has continued to undermine quick and generous and effective responses, although there are linkages that could be made, which I'll talk about. There also needs to be a strong constituency support for refugee protection. People who are willing to get out ahead and are hopefully part of groups that can together exert some pressure. So the faith-based community has been extremely important, but so have veterans. And particularly in situations in which the people who are being persecuted are ones who have associated themselves with the US government and have helped the military. And that's why we see a quicker response in Afghanistan now, since the Taliban took over than we did for many years previous to that, where there wasn't as strong a sense of obligation to Afghanistan or to the Afghans who are with us. There needs to be a clear and immediate humanitarian imperative, and it needs to be well publicized. The press, much of the research has shown in my own experience, doesn't necessarily get ahead of the curve, but if they sense that there is constituency support, if there's political support for it, the press can make a tremendous difference in moving from modest to strong response on the part of the US because of the humanitarian imperatives. Many of you probably remember the photo of the young boy, Syrian boy, and that just generated such positive interest in helping refugees in Europe and elsewhere that you can, it's clearly, almost palpable. And of course, you need political leaders willing to take a strong and positive stance and do so regardless of public opinion. And that we've learned the hard way. When Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1938 saw what was happening in Nazi Germany, he actually did call for an international convention that took place in Evian in France to figure out what to do about the mostly Jewish but other refugees coming out of Nazi Germany. But the US, in calling the conference, said, "We will not change our immigration policy, nor do we expect any other country to do so." And as a result, this conference was a complete failure. And Hitler, in talking about the conference at its end, said that it proved to him that that the world would not care no matter what he did to the Jews. And it became a prologue to the Holocaust. So we've had really bad experiences as well as some very good experiences. Our policy leadership takes many forms. Probably the most important globally is the financial support that we give for refugee assistance and protection. We are the largest donors, and even through the Trump administration remained a very large donor to the UNHCR, to the UN Relief and Works Administration, and although that was cut off by the Trump administration, and other agencies working with refugees. We also use our diplomacy to support refugee rights. When the State Department issues its annual human rights report, it also talks about what's happening to refugees, asylum seekers in other countries. Resettlement of refugees to the US is extremely important, not because of the numbers of people who are resettled, because a very, very small portion of the world's refugees are able to get to another country after they fled to a country of first asylum where they were first able to get in. It's very, very small numbers worldwide, only about 1 million out of the 20 some odd million ever have that opportunity. But it has, and I'll go through some of the other benefits that can influence the policies of other countries. We also need to work more on practicing what we preach in our own asylum policies. When I was directing the US Commission, and I made visits to refugee camps and urban areas around the world, I would talk about, well, why aren't you not allowing more refugees in or whatever? And the first thing I would hear at that time in the 1990s was, well, why is the United States deporting Haitians and not even allowing them to apply for asylum? So whatever we do becomes a mirror for a lot of other countries and either influences their policies for the good or for the worse. And then we need to be doing more, and the US has been a leader here in expanding protection of all vulnerable populations. And the most recent thing is the Biden administration, when it first came in, authorized a study to be done, and a report was issued on what to do about climate change and movements of people, their displacement. So thinking through and helping other countries to think through what might be done in those areas. Now, the current legislative framework is the Refugee Act of 1980. It hasn't been changed in very important ways since then, although there are changes that have mostly made it harder for people to get asylum. But the definition is important. Up until 1980, a refugee in US law was defined as someone fleeing communism. So this was in accord with the Cold War rationale for refugee assistance and protection. The US adopted the UN definition in 1980, and it has several aspects to it which are important to know because they determine whether or not someone's seeking to enter as a refugee through the resettlement program or claim asylum at the border or in the interior of the country are able to obtain refugee status. First, they have to have a well-founded fear, and that means that they have to show objective facts that a reasonable person would see as being a reason for being afraid of staying where you were. Also, they have to show an adjudicator that there's a subjective fear that you actually emotionally and internally are afraid. It has to be of a particular thing, and that's persecution, which is a particular harm that is well beyond discrimination, for example, or just any old human rights violation. It has to be something that puts you at risk of death or dismemberment or things of that sort. But it has to be on the basis of the things that in 1951, when the UN Convention was adopted, were the basis for persecution, or thought to be the basis, and that's race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. You'll notice one thing missing from that list, and that's gender or sex. That is not included. Usually cases involving gender-based persecution are dealt with under the rubric as membership in a particular social group. But that doesn't always fit the situation. Okay, so we have a universal definition through the 80 Act. There are now annual consultations on the number of refugees to be admitted into the US, and it changes from year to year. Originally, there was a floor of 50,000 refugees, but that expired after 3 years. So now the problem with the consultations are that it depends very much on what the president of the time thinks is the proper number, not necessarily what the circumstances, as I showed in the global situation, would require of US leadership. I'll come back to that. It also provided a funding and an organizational structure for domestic assistance to refugees. It was a recognition that they often have had to leave everything behind, and they need some assistance until they're able to settle in and get jobs, etc. And before that, it was all ad hoc. Now there is a particular program, the Department of Health and Human Services, and another one in the State Department that helps with the placement and integration of refugees. And it included 2 paragraphs on asylum. 90% of the 95% or so of the legislation is on resettlement. Asylum got a couple of words, and in these two paragraphs, which means that it can be almost anything that one wants it to be, because it's not very well defined. And again, sometimes that's for better, sometimes it's for worse. I won't go through the subsequent legislation, but I'll need to say, I'll come back to a couple of these points. One is temporary protected status, which was an attempt to get help for people already in the country who couldn't return because of either conflict or a natural disaster in their home countries. And it's still in operation today. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, ARRA, introduced expedited removal for those who wanted to apply for asylum, but were still at the border seeking entry. And then the variety of other pieces of legislation toughened the asylum admissions processes and also made it easier to deport asylum seekers and refugees on terrorism and criminal grounds. So things have tightened up somewhat. The Trump presidency, and I won't go into details on this because all of us lived through it, but they gutted the US refugee resettlement program. They imposed tremendous barriers on seeking asylum, particularly preventing people from actually crossing into the country. And that has continued well into the Biden administration. They sought to remove some of the TPS protections. We had the separated children from their families and family detention, eliminated funding for important programs for refugees, and weakened our leadership, and particularly at the within the UN system. There were 2 global compacts that were negotiated, and the US refused to sign either of them and convinced some other governments with right-wing administrations to follow suit. I'm not going to go through this, but it's a way of just as a graphic showing how complicated the refugee and asylum system is in the US. There's the refugee resettlement process is the one I talked about, and we'll say some more on. Affirmative asylum process is for people who are already in the United States. Many of them enter on valid visas, but they can also just show up at a Department of Homeland Security asylum office and request asylum. And they can either be granted it by an asylum officer or referred to an immigration court for a hearing. Next one is for arriving asylum seekers, people who are apprehended or turn themselves in at the border. And they go through this process of credible fear. It's a lesser standard than a full asylum procedure would require, but it's still showing that you have a credible story. You're coming from a country where there's conflict, where there's persecution, where there are major human rights violations. And then that gets you into the system if you pass through it. And then if you're picked up, apprehended within the country, within the US, and you apply for asylum, you then can go through another whole process that will get you possibly into the country, allowed to stay in the country. Okay, back to resettlement then, after looking at all this stuff. There are a lot of benefits of resettlement, not just to the refugees, but to the US. It does provide a solution for refugees with no other alternatives. There are 3 durable solutions for refugees. One is most hoped for is to be able to return to your home country and resume a normal life. The second is to integrate in the country in which you first got safety. And the third is to be resettled to a third country where the language might be different, the customs, you're farther from home, etc. So it's more difficult for the people themselves. But when you can't go home and you can't stay where you are, resettlement is the only solution for a refugee, or else they are under serious threat. It's also been used as a tool to persuade the countries of first asylum to allow the refugees to enter their territories. During the period of the Indo-Chinese refugee movements out of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the US called it, President Carter called a conference similar in intent to the one in Avion, but in this case, he sent the vice president to represent the United States, and Vice President Mondale announced that the US would accept 14,000 refugees from Southeast Asia per month until the situation stabilized. So it was a major commitment for the US, and it led to commitments from many other countries. It's also a safety net to people endangered by their association with us that I mentioned in terms of the Afghans. It's a way that we can say to them, if you get in trouble, we'll resettle you as a refugee and you'll find safety. So right now it's not working. The formal process. The numbers were very small during the Trump administration, and they haven't increased significantly, although the cap has. The ceiling now is up to 125,000, but we're still only resettling in the 15, 20, 25,000 range at most. That's partly because the resettlement infrastructure was almost completely destroyed during the Trump administration because of the low numbers, and hasn't been able to really get going again in the way it's needed. And you can see that the numbers go up and down depending on what's happening. They were high during the Southeast Asian refugee situation, also Soviet Union, other communist countries. We still had that as our primary resettlement. It went down and then came back up during the Bosnian conflict and we began to resettle more people. Went back down with the with 9/11, struggled to increase, although the numbers, the cap stayed up. And then during the Trump administration, it went way down. And as I said before, the ceiling is up, but not the numbers. Humanitarian parole that you've probably heard about in the news had been the default method for refugee admissions before 1980. That's how in 1975, we evacuated people from Vietnam. In 1956, we resettled the Hungarian refugees. We had airlifts and boat movements out of Cuba in the 1960s. This was all done under a parole system that allowed people to come in. Now we've just in the last year and a half or so have been using it for the Central American minors with connections to people living in the US, the Afghans who assisted us, plus others, and Ukrainians and most recently Venezuelans. It has a lot of very positive elements to it. We got up and running extremely quickly because nobody had to go through the procedures required of the Resettlement Act. But there are some real constraints. It doesn't allow for family reunification. And so there's no obvious way that people who got out can bring their families with them. Very limited access to refugee services, although there's some private sponsorship arrangements that have been very important, and no pathway to permanent residence or pathway towards citizenship. And so humanitarian parole is sometimes necessary, but never the desirable route to go because of these limitations. Now, quickly on the asylum system, there are these three different types of systems that I mentioned. Definition, it's the same for all of them. So again, the thing is proving that your persecution is because of race, religion, nationality, etc. And there are now extremely large backlogs and very lengthy waiting times. There are about 450,000 applications in the affirmative system that is decided by asylum officers, and about 2 million pending in the defenses system. And each of these have multiple people, so there are probably about 4 to 5 million people who are affected by these backlogs. And right now, I just looked it up yesterday, it takes 1,100 days to complete a case.
Oh.
And what that's doing is it means that after 6 months, people are eligible to apply for a work permit. And that means that asylum has again become a way for people who don't really have a strong claim to asylum to game the system. And it just makes the backlogs even worse. TPS is, as I said, triggered in conflict and disaster situations. These are just some of the countries that have received it, but you have to have entered the United States prior to the declaration of temporary protected status. So it doesn't help with flight. It only helps with non-return, which it's not an only, it's an important element of things. But the biggest problem is that there's no mechanism to provide legal permanent residence for people who receive TPS. It's in that way the same as humanitarian parole. And if the cause persists and they can't go home, they remain in limbo status throughout. And if conditions change and they want to go home, there are ways to help refugees go home. But they don't apply to temporary protected status because it's not considered to be a real refugee system. So what can we do? And I'll close here. What the League can do is to advocate for protection, make sure that our voice is heard and heard loudly, and in combination with all of the other coalitions that support protection globally and in the US. And it's important to do both. not just to be focused on what happens here, because such an important part of US policy is making sure that people are protected when they're and assisted when they can't come here or any other place. And so that needs financial support for refugees, also internally displaced persons, because they're the majority of displaced persons and others in life-threatening situations. And we really need to be doing these two things now, because with climate change likely to increase displacement significantly in the future, it's important that we have the systems in place to make sure that US aid can get out there quickly. It's spread across a lot of different US agencies today, and it's not always efficient or effective. We should be advocating for increases in refugee resettlement, with a particular focus on those women who are in situations where they have experienced rape, and that's one of the reasons that they fled, and then experience it in flight and experience again when they're in a refugee camp or a settlement. And for them, being able to resettle may literally be a matter of life or death. And one of the ways to help the situation is to have a permanent floor on the numbers to be admitted. It doesn't have to go back to the 50,000 that we had in 1980, but advocates have been advocating for more like 125,000 or so, but for it to be just operate like everything else in our immigration system, so it doesn't require a presidential declaration. And therefore it depoliticizes the decision to admit refugees. It should always be able to be raised in case there's a major emergency, but there should be at least a floor on what we do. Private sponsorship programs are already in place for humanitarian parole and are coming for refugees. It was supposed to be announced in the fall, but I think it's taking a little bit longer to figure it out. So encouraging participation in these private efforts can have a big effect in terms of increasing the numbers of refugees who can be admitted into the US, because it's showing constituent support, but it's also providing financial resources to the refugees. We need to be supporting reforms in asylum. And these are reducing the backlog, but in a way that is humane and cognizant of the needs of the asylum seekers, and not just reducing them through a backdoor of closing cases without hearing them. We need to make sure that those facing domestic and gang violence, and particularly in Central America, but it's really all over the world, have a potential for coming in, even though they may not fit one of the current grounds for a fear of persecution, but stretching the definition to include them, which we've done in other cases, and providing access to legal representation for asylum seekers. A study that was done at Georgetown by my colleagues a number of years ago showed that if you had counsel, you were at least about 5 times or more likely to receive asylum than if you went in the system just on your own. So it's really an important thing in a very complex system. And advocate a pathway to permanent residence for people with TPS, as well as the humanitarian parole beneficiaries. So I will end there, and sorry I took longer than even the half hour, I think, but.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a wonderful overview. I'd like to suggest that people do use the hand raising function that is at the bottom of the screen under reactions. Okay, Beryl, you have a question.
Susan, there were quotas for different countries. Do we still have that?
No, we have it's more complex now. The national origins quotas came into effect in 1921 as a pilot and became part of regular law in 1924 were not repealed until 1965, and it was as one of the civil rights actions. And it's something that John F. Kennedy had been pushing for. And so in honor of his legacy, it finally got passed. What they put in place was that no country can have more than a set percentage of the immigrants coming in without, and for many of the work permits and some of the family visas that are available. And so a country like Mexico hits its 26,000 possible entries very soon, very quickly each year. Other countries that have very few immigrants coming into the country never use their full quota potential, ceiling up on that. And there have been efforts to strip away any of these quotas, but the concern has been that if you take them away too quickly, then people from other countries will never come in, will not come in 10, 20, 30 years because of the backlogs for Mexico, India, and China, Philippines. They have so many pending visas that without the annual quotas, they won't be able to get in. So it's a complicated situation. I think they should be eliminated, and we should just do a big backlog clearance for all the people that have been in waiting. There are people that are applied to join their siblings in the US 30 years ago that are still waiting for admission. It's a crazy system.
Anybody else? I have a question. Oh, Catherine, why don't you go?
Okay. Susan, thank you so much for this, and thank you for your final, or was it the next to final slide that said what can or should LWV do? Because that's, you talk to a league audience and the first question we always have is, what can we do? And I was a little daunted by that list. It was not only long, but there seemed to be so many moving parts. So my question would be, and this is maybe too hard to answer, but you possibly have ideas. Are there certain specific reforms that could be rationally undertaken or relatively feasible that would solve several of these issues? For example, like the humanitarian parole, temporary protected status categories, where there's these added obstacles to simply getting residence or access to services or a path to citizenship. Is there one or two steps that the league could press on the legislature to take that might resolve several of the problems at the same time, streamline it a bit? If you
Right,
had...
and there is pending legislation that Zoe Lofgren and Dick Durbin have introduced over the years that deal with some of the problems. There's also an immediate and a longer term listing, right. And there are some of the things that I put up are things that need to happen over and over and over again, and they're things that don't involve legislation. They're just, I mean, the encouragement of refugee protection, you don't have to have a law that's going to do that.
Okay, what else would be
but some of the things that I think are immediate, one is on TPS supporting the pending legislation to provide a legal permanent residence to the people who have been under TPS. The earliest group would be people from El Salvador who received it in 1998 during Hurricane Mitch. Oh no, there are earthquakes there, and then you have it 2 years later. You have the Nicaraguans and Hondurans from Hurricane Mitch. So we've got some people who have been under temporary protection for a long time. That's the short-term thing because it's actually pending as the House has already passed it. So it's a matter of getting it through
I have a
the
question.
Senate.
Other question, Ann Ballard, I see a hand. Can you unmute?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Susan. You're obviously very well briefed in all of this and have had a lot of background in it. And I'm also a new member on the island here on San Juan Island with your group. So I hope to meet you in person soon.
Great.
But my question is, at the end where you were talking about ensuring access for asylum for those facing, different things, including gang violence. And I wonder whether is there any way Haitians can be included that we would, because, it's just run by gangs right now. And I just know there's always been such a problem with getting Haitians into the country. So I'd like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, the gang violence provision would definitely help Haitians who are getting out and coming in to apply for asylum on that. There's a long history in terms of failures of the US government with regard to Haitian and some successes, but usually the successes were when it was associated with another group, particularly the Cubans. And so if the Cubans got special status, the Haitians piggybacked on it, on that. But other than that, there's been a tendency to return Haitians who were in small boats without even giving them the chance to apply for asylum. So that's been problematic. I think when I talk about the asylum system in terms of and it's the refugee system more generally on domestic and gang-based violence, it's been a ping pong game almost. So in the Clinton administration, there was a real openness to accepting women who were, or children who were affected by things like gang violence or domestic violence as a particular social group and bringing them in or allowing them to receive asylum. And then during other administrations, and most notably the Trump administration, there was actually a directive saying that, no, this is all personal assaults. This hasn't anything to do with what the refugee definition is talking about. It's not, and it was cut off totally. Biden, it's been brought back again, but what we need is a legislative solution at some point that will define it in law rather than have it to be something that each administration is able to make its own decisions on. So on a long-term basis, I think that we're not facing the crisis now that we were during 3-4 years ago, but it's still hanging over us.
I see we have 3 hands up. I think we could deal with those 3 questions. Gerald Schatz?
Yes, thank you. I may have missed it, but there are a couple of items on my agenda that I would like to see addressed. One is the Dreamers. And as other people have remarked in other fora, this lame duck session of Congress may be the last chance. The second thing is the extraordinary error rate in the handling of cases in the various agencies of the Department of Homeland Security. Both USCIS and ICE lose documents. The error rate is staggering, and it has inhumane consequences. And finally, there is the problem of the consular service and its contractors. They are overwhelmed. There is a traditional bias in State Department, I'm sorry to say, against people who apply to come to the United States. And a lot of this work is also being farmed out to contractors. Additionally, those people who are in the United States and told that in order to pursue their process, their cases, they have to go outside the country to consular process.
Gerald, are you
in
going
a
to ask
position-
a question? It feels like you're making
I'm
comments
asking
and-
that these go on your list of things to
concern.
worry about.
But the
Okay.
DACA is clearly on the leaks list, and in fact, there's been some new advocacy on that for the in relationship to the lame duck. And I just, in case anybody misunderstood, I really was talking only about U.S. refugee policy and asylum policy, not the broader immigration policy. I don't disagree with anything that you've said. And it does have some trickle down effects. One of the things I'm really proud of in terms of my own career was working with the Bush administration, first Bush administration, and then the Clinton administration to have a specialized asylum corps that would not be, that would be trained in asylum issues. Prior to that, you know, somebody would be adjudicating a family petition at 10 o'clock in the morning, an employment petition at 11 o'clock, and then an asylum appeal at, you know, so it was, they had no specialized training. So I agree with what you're saying very much. But again, it was outside of the list that I was talking about. And
Yeah.
that's why I didn't raise them.
Maria Cordova. Can
Thank you. I really appreciate this talk, even enlightenment to me in many senses. But I'm concerned about the system that exists in immigration in general with the law. Is that still something that's happening?
Sorry, you broke up, and I don't know if others had a
For
better.
people wanting to come to the country without any reason.
Yeah, I mean, we are in desperate need of immigration reform throughout. After, you know, that's not new. I mean, we didn't have an immigration law that determined admissions standards until 1875, and then really began to build in the 1880s and 90s. The 1924 Act stayed in play, was the first time we had quantitative ceilings on admissions. Up until that time, there were no quotas at all. And that stayed from 1924 to 1965, you know, for a very long period. And then we had reforms again in the early 1990s on our legal immigration system, and that's still in place in 2022. So it's never been easy to get immigration reform. And the thing that really kills it is looking to do everything at once. That when we go for comprehensive immigration reform, it's supposed to be getting a compromise on everything. Nobody gets everything, but somebody gets something. And it ends up being, number one, bad law, bad policy. And number two, stymied because there are people who don't want any changes on both ends of the spectrum. And so I mean, my advice is always get what you can when you can get it, and work the list so that eventually you get all the changes, but don't hold what you can do. I mean, the Dreamers Act, the Dream Act, was introduced by Orrin Hatch, Republican of Utah, in the 1990s. And instead of saying, thank you, let's go for it, when it had substantial bipartisan support, it was always put into the effort at comprehensive, and it never went anywhere. So, you know, we should never ask for more than we can actually get if there is a possibility for getting something good.
Yeah, that's very wise. I see Beryl, you've had your hand up for a
Yeah.
while. I think that should be our last.
Thank you.
You're muted.
You're muted, Beryl.
Back to the Haitians and other minority groups, it seems to me there's a lot of racial discrimination. And I was just wondering if you agree with that.
Yes, I mean, it's impossible to look at the history of our policies with regard to Haiti, not just the immigration policies, but the policies more broadly, without acknowledging that there is a heavy racist element to it, particularly because in juxtaposing the policies towards Cuba and the policies towards Haiti, you get, some of it is political because of the Cold War and all of that. There are other factors that are at work, but there is a heavy racial element to it. And throughout our history, we have had periods in which racism has really dominated the discourse on immigration. And it's not, at certain points, it's different groups or the racial minority. And it's Irish in the 1840s, it's Jews and Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans in the 1890s. And it has more focused, as Mexicans in the 1920s. And now we're continuing to see that as a strand. I don't think it's any more the dominant strand, but I think it's a very important one in our policymaking.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Susan. I think we give her a round of applause any way we can. This was a terrific, with great long-term perspective, which we all need. I see there's lots of clapping hands around. So very, very appreciative.
Quick question, Susan, can you share your slideshow?
Yes, I may have to take out a couple of pictures that I don't have the
Take your time to edit it where you.
copyright out of it, but the one,
Great.
the
Thank you.
last part of it were actually pictures from trips I've
Excellent.
done. So yes, I can. I'd be happy
If you
to.
send it to me or Jane, we will, make it available to the interest groups.
Yes. And we are planning to make the video of this available as well. We have to, get it onto YouTube, but we're hoping to, because a lot of people wanted to hear it. So I think we have some business items that we wanted to talk about. But the first one, in response to Gerald's concern, is that our group is very pleased because we gave a big push, a big letter to the advocacy team at LWV US to advocate for DACA in the DREAM Act in the lame duck session. And I'll tell you, it was last week, it was like the jet engines at LWVS started to roll. So there's press releases. They have sent a letter to all Congress, and we encourage you to encourage any league members to write their senators in particular. There is a version of the DREAM Act that has passed the House in March of 21, but it's those 10 GOP senators that are the kind of linchpin, as with everything. So especially if you're in a state with GOP senators, please write them. But we're pleased that LWV US has been so responsive to this issue. I think that I wanted to say a couple of things about where our group is going from here. We are planning to have a meeting in January for everyone across the country to talk a bit about program planning at the state level, because this coming year, this is going to be more state level program planning, and then there will be state conventions. So we're planning a meeting on Tuesday, January 17th at 4 o'clock. We'll send notices to talk about the year ahead. I think once we see what has happened in the lame duck Congress and see, what moves are being made, what will, transfer in from in the new Congress, there'll be some good discussion. But I think those were the main kind of business items that we had on our agenda. I did want to say we do use the Google group as a way to communicate and send both information as well as interesting articles. If any of you would like to be in the Google group who aren't, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I'm one of the administrators of it, so I can just add your. I'm going to give you my league address, but that was what I had to say. I don't know, Catherine, Beryl, or Meredith, what?
Yeah, I mean, you should tell them about the meeting with Jessica.
Oh, yes. Yes. So Jessica, let me just get this in the chat. Yeah. So the head of director of advocacy for LWV US is a woman named Jessica Jones Caparel. And we have been emailing with her about advocacy about the DREAM Act, as well as about the registry. And we're kind of feeling our way with how to work best with LWV US, but they do seem to look to us to give them suggestions. So if anybody has suggestions within the realm of LWV positions, you have to stay in that.
Good to hear.
And so we are going to be having a meeting with Jessica next Tuesday at 7 o'clock Pacific, 10 o'clock Eastern time. So if any of you would like to join that.
AM.
7 a.m.
Yeah, AM, right. We West Coasters get up early. Please also email me and I'll be sure you have the Zoom link for it. And so that will be a good opportunity to converse more with them. But we feel we've come a long way in the last 6 months. We're excited to have a good working relationship with LWV US, and just great to see so many faces here this evening. So also suggestions, please let us know what you need, what you want, what you'd like to see.
Yeah, can I just re-emphasize that if I could? This LWV US Immigration Interest Group, the Google group that Jane mentioned, is a great place for us to share. What we want to do is to continue to share things happening in our own states, because some of the senators and Congress members for the states where we have active league members have been doing really great work. The Senator Durbin, as you mentioned, the state senator from California is one of the members, Padilla. He's a leader in a group that just a few days ago came out and told all of their colleagues in Congress that they have to do something to protect DACA before the end of the term. So we were very excited about that. If you are going to communicate with your elected representatives, just one quick reminder, but an important one, if they're already doing the right thing from your point of view and they've been voting, then don't assume that that's okay. You have to thank them. You have to communicate with them, thank them for all they've done, assure them of your support, and ask them to keep working hard. So they know, that you're behind them. I like Susan's final statement about maybe the whole thrust for comprehensive immigration reform is not realistic. And if you want to get things done, then you may have to do, as we're hoping to do with DACA, you find the low-hanging fruit that has already got a lot of support, and you push on that as hard as you can. And that may be the tactic that we need to consider, as opposed to constantly saying we have to have comprehensive reform. But others may disagree.
I just want to say one other thing, which is if anybody would like to help us work on getting a website, if anybody has any
Yeah.
particular skills, we could use those. So, Beryl?
I'm just wondering if you should mention about the caucus idea, that we would put together a caucus presentation that leagues can use at their state conventions.
Why don't you expand a little on that?
Okay, so we've done it in the California and the US for the last 2 years, and it's been quite well received, and we've picked up a lot more interest in immigration. I'm not sure we need program planning, at least in California we don't, but in some states could use additional ideas about what would help immigrants and refugees living in their state, such as being allowed to drive or getting in-state college tuition, that sort of thing. So take a look at what's offered by your state, and you may want to do some program planning ideas at your state level, but we do want to keep educating as many people as we can. And so we think if we sign up to give a caucus on immigration at each state level, that would be a good way to spread the word.
And we thought we would offer, some supportive ideas that, or even a PowerPoint that people could take to their state conventions. It's such a changing topic. All the time there's new shifts of the wind, shifts of the legal situation. So we'll just try to keep up to date.
Is there anything that someone here would like to see done when we meet again in January? Because that's when we are going to start doing some real looking forward. If you
Terry,
have
I see-
ideas, send an
Terry.
email.
Before that, I would like to say that as of yesterday, the Immigration Committee of the League of Women Voters of New Jersey has gotten through our state office, et cetera, a draft letter to the editor to go out in the next, which we hope local leagues will circulate in the next week to their local papers, asking for further support, interest, et cetera, in the DREAM Act. If you want us to send a copy to you, to whom? To Catherine?
Or Jane
You
put her.
can
Jane,
send it out
And
quickly.
I'll circulate. I'll put it in the Google group.
we'll post
All
it.
right, fine,
That would be
fine. I'll
fabulous.
send it. I'll send it. I mean, Deborah and I have been through this yesterday with our state legislative representatives, and we think it's pretty good and ready to go.
That
Wonderful.
is
And
so
it's helpful. It's going out to our local league, all state local leagues today, actually simultaneously with this meeting. We're both skipping the local leaders meeting for this, but
Yeah, that's great.
it's
That
done.
Meredith, we haven't heard from you.
Meredith.
Oh, yes. Well,
Yes.
I just want to reiterate that anyone can post information. Of course, we're always nonpartisan and we want to stay within the league guidelines and so on. But if you have something you are working on in your state and you want, how do you, for instance, somebody asked me, I think it was Nina, said, well, how did Arizona get the initiative for in-state tuition through? And I don't know. It's certain states have citizens initiatives, but that's the kind of thing that we could share. If you've worked on something like that, I think it's very helpful to give a whole process, and you don't have to always respond back to the whole list. You can see who's written and just respond individually. In fact, that's what I would suggest, unless you think it's going to be of general interest. But for instance, I know Gerald has a lot of expertise here, and I know a lot of people here do, but I would love to hear, I don't know if I missed it, but what people think is going to happen with the Supreme Court case and what the implications are going to be. And, I mean, there are a lot of things that I think we could share. And I just encourage us to have, open discussions about what we're working on, what we fear, what we want to applaud, etc. So thank you.
Great. Anybody else? Hopefully, I think the meeting in January, we don't have a speaker, so it should be more of a forum for general discussion. So I think, that would be a good one for people to come and, bring ideas and things you'd like to talk more about too.
And if you've joined this meeting because you heard about it or someone sent you the link, please send Jane and or me your email address so we can be absolutely sure that you get notified of the next one. We promise we won't share it with anyone else, but please do. Or join the Google group, because the Google group always receives the announcements of the meetings and the links to join. Okay, thanks so much, and thank you, Jane. That was great.
And Susan.
Susan, for sure.
Great job.
We learned so much. Yeah,
Thank you
I
so
have
much.
already seen
Yeah, right.
comments in the chat saying, I can't wait to get that slideshow. So,
Thank you. That was terrific.
all right. Good night,
All right. Happy December,
Good night, everybody.
everyone.
Right.
All right,
Happy
superb
holidays.
program.
Support the DREAM Act.
Yes.
Right.
That's your homework.
Thank you so much.
Right now, do it.
Get
Yeah.
in touch with your
All right.
congressional representatives. Thank you.
Oh, Meredith, how are you?
Yeah.
Gone. Oh, well, we'll find out next week.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Good meeting.
Thank you.
Yes,
Somebody's gonna thank Susan.
We did, but
I will send her a
thank you.
note
Email.
as
Okay.
well.
Right.
Okay, and you're gonna send me the
I'll send you the recording. Yeah.
recording.
And
yeah.
send it to me too, and
I
I'll
will.
work with Kim on getting it on the website.
It's probably going to need editing before you stick it on a YouTube, but not much. Okay. Good night, everybody. I'm ending the.
Bye-bye. It's just me.
Okay. Take care.